Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining today. So I'll start straight away. The subject I wish to speak about today is a vision for modal music, or specifically for contemporary modal music. For a start, we should perhaps give something of a definition of modal music. It actually falls into several categories, but the category I'm most concerned with here is what we tend to refer to as Eastern modal music, although even the Eastern is not entirely accurate. Morocco is west of Germany, but as a general category, it's more or less effective. And specifically within the world of modal music, a very, very large component of it is the whole world of what we refer to as makam, which is found in various different forms in the different environments where we find it. In the various different areas of the Arab world, makam has differences. It's not entirely the same everywhere. In Turkey, again, it's different. In Central Asia, it's different. In the Transcaucasia, even going as far as Western China, in the Uyghur regions, we have the 12 makam, the 12 makam system, which is used by them. In all of these cases, we find certain very common elements, even though there are significant differences between them. Perhaps the most common, the most important two, what you might call pillars of the whole modal music world are, on the one hand, phrasing. Modal music is much, much more about phrasing than it is about scales. People tend to overemphasize scales, especially in theory books. But the real essence of it, especially in the whole makam world, is phrasing. In the North and South Indian world of raga, things are a little bit different. There is more of an emphasis on what we call the octave scale, whereas in the whole makam world, there's much, much less emphasis on that, and everything is about phrasing. The other essential pillar of that whole world is the whole concept of the local idiom. In this context, it's important to see that music, especially in this whole region of the world, tends to go much more regionally than it does ethnically. So the people who inhabit one particular region tend to have a sound which is characteristic of that particular region. I can give you one very good example, which is the entirety of Transcaucasia, which is a quite large geographical area which contains a myriad of different peoples who live there. However, just about any music that you can hear from Transcaucasia, regardless of whether it's Armenian, Azeri, Georgian, or Dagestani, or Chechen, or anything else, even though they're in that whole area, almost every village has its own individual repertoire and its own individual idiom, but there is a sound, you can immediately hear that that's something coming from Transcaucasia. There's a sound of that particular geographical area. The same is true if I look at other geographical areas, that all of the people who happen to inhabit that region have the same or a very, very similar sound, which is very characteristic of the region, regardless of whether they may be of different ethnic groups, religious groups, or even races. So the whole concept of the local idiom, together with the concept of the phrase, is most important, because even though the local idiom maybe doesn't travel as well, it tends to be more fixed in a geographical location, the phrasing does travel. And that's why we do find many examples of melodies which have moved from one area to another and have adapted from one idiom to another. We have, even here in Greece, we have plenty of songs which the same basic song, the same basic melodic archetype can be found in a myriad of different cultures. And that's an example of how the different phrases actually tend to travel quite easily and adapt to the local idioms wherever they happen to find themselves. This whole concept of modality, however, is radically different from what, well, you've probably noticed that, for example, in jazz, people tend to refer to modality. They use what they refer to as the ancient Greek modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, etc. which actually not the ancient Greek modes. The ancient Greek modes were actually quite different from what is described today. But they tend to refer to something different, which is the use of scale patterns, which is not really the same idea. It's a rather different idea then. So within this particular context, I'm referring much more to what I described initially, somewhat inaccurately, as Eastern modality, which is a rough approximation anyway, which especially is concerned very largely with the whole Makam world. And that, of course, includes the Persian Dastgah system, which, even though it uses a different terminology, or the Byzantine ecosystem as well, which again uses a totally different terminology. But all of these different traditions tend to work with a rather similar thought pattern, which is what I'll be focusing on here. Within each of these idioms, and within this whole world of modality, we find today that these traditions tend to be defined ethnically. And we find also that they tend to be defined as urban and rural, which of course that has always existed. But the contemporary translation of urban and rural tends to be classical and folk, which I find to be a little bit problematic actually. You can see, for example, that we have classical Arabic music, we have classical Turkish music, classical Uzbek, classical Tajik, classical Afghani music, North Indian classical music, South Indian classical music. Everybody seems to have a classical musical tradition, without having ever actually clearly defined what exactly do they mean by classical. In my own sort of examination of it, what I have noticed is that on the one hand, what people tend to refer to as classical usually tends to be an urban tradition, with the characteristics which we find in urban traditions, that there tends to be an emphasis on composers who we happen to know. Also, there's the element of the specific environments in which this music would be played. For example, in an urban tradition, in the past, it tended to be within palaces, for example, as court music, or within a religious context, within different religious environments. Whereas folk music, what we refer to as folk music, the rural music, tended to be used within the context of events within rural environments, in villages like weddings, or in various celebrations which they would have in that environment. So, even though no one really very clearly defines what they mean by classical, referring to this as classical music, whatever else, there is a bit of a problem, because each of these classical musics, as they call them, tends to be defined ethnically. So we have Turkish classical music, we have Persian classical music, we have Afghani or Indian. And this is rather interesting. So when I decided to think about, okay, well, since they're all basically following a lead of Western classical music, basically, which they sort of, this whole idea of calling something classical is a bit of sort of envy towards that direction. Well, what is the difference? So I thought, well, let me ask, let's take an example, an Italian classical musician. What do you play? What is your music? What is the music which you consider to be yours, which is of your world? And he would say, well, my music is Vivaldi, who's Italian. My music is Beethoven, who's German. My music is Grieg, who's Norwegian. Tchaikovsky, who's Russian, etc. Interesting, okay. So if I were then to ask a Turkish classical musician, sorry, I'm a bit ill. If I were to ask a Turkish classical musician, what is your music? What do you play? Well, he would give me a list of various Ottoman composers, some of whom would belong to minorities, yes, but all belonging to the Ottoman world, to a very specific geographical region, specifically to the city of Istanbul. So he would say, well, my music is Dede Effendi, it's Tambur Jamil Bey, it's maybe Zakaria, maybe Tamburi Isak, or someone like that. If I were to then ask him, well, do you not sometimes play maybe Iranian composers or Arab? No, we don't play that sort of stuff. No, we play this. Okay, I could ask the same question of an Iranian classical musician, and he would mention that he plays Parviz Meskatyan, or he plays Abdul Hassan Sabah, or all these different composers. Yes. Do you sometimes play maybe Tamburi Jamil Bey or something like that? No, we don't play that repertoire. So each one of them is somewhat locked into an ethnic stereotype, into an ethnic category, into a nationalist tradition, basically. Even though this is not the historical reality of this music, because if we were to look back in history, we would see that the early Ottoman tradition was very heavily influenced by Persian music. We would also see composers like Abdul Qadir Meraghi of the 14th century, who was revered by both the Persians, by the Turks, by the Azeris, and his music was even heard as far afield as Herat in what is today Afghanistan. And there were many of these overarching figures, or like Al-Farabi himself in the 9th century, or Safi al-Din or Qutb al-Din in the 13th century, the theoreticians, who were not clearly delineated as being members of one culture or of another, but they sort of had an overarching influence. This I found to be of particular interest. And I find this particular idea to be something which it's rather sad, the fact that everybody is now locked into an ethnic stereotype, into a nationalist culture, and not looking further afield. I can remember myself in the early 1980s when I was studying lira on the island of Crete with Kostas Moundakis, and I was studying kemençe, or the Turkish lira, in Istanbul with Ihsan Özgen. On Crete, nobody knew that in Istanbul they played lira. In Istanbul, nobody knew that they played lira on Crete, and neither knew that they played it in Bulgaria next door, or in the south of Italy, or in many other locations. And I always found this to be rather tragic, the fact that all of these different people who had so much shared material were not aware, the one of what the other was doing. They all knew Michael Jackson's latest hits, however, so that was, in my view, rather sad. I thought that there's not enough connection between them. Going back to the example of the Italian classical musician who I mentioned, who would be playing composers from a variety of different backgrounds and different nationalities, what is of interest there is that, well, let's go back to the 1940s, when everybody in Europe basically hated Hitler and everything that he stood for. But nobody thought to dislike Beethoven or Bach or any of these German composers who everybody felt that this was part of their culture, regardless of whether they were French or English or Spanish or Italian. So the fact that the Western world has this tradition, which they refer to as classical, which does actually act as a unifying force on a cultural level, not necessarily on a political one, of course, but certainly on a cultural level, is something which I've always considered to be important. And it's something which I felt to be sadly lacking in the Eastern world, a region of the world which, as we see in the present day, suffers very, very badly from extreme political situations, problems, even warfare, and a sort of fragmentation, basically. And it would be something of great importance if there were a musical tradition in which each of them could see something of themselves. Quite coincidentally, due to the nature of technology today, apart from anything else, there are a number of people today who are composing music which draws on a number of sources. For example, I can think of some people who compose music, and if you listen to their music, you can hear influences from Indian music, or you can hear influences from Persian music in it, or even Turkish or any other tradition. And of course, there are people doing what we refer to as world music, which I don't really consider to be all that serious. It's sort of a bit superficial. But there are other people who've studied some of these traditions in quite considerable depth. And the music that they are creating, because these different traditions are a part of their life, and an important part of their life, they tend to merge and integrate in a much more natural way within these particular people. And I think this is going to be something which will occur much more often in the future, given that people no longer really live within such narrowly defined borders as they did in the past. So that's why several years ago, in an effort to describe, I was forced to describe what I do. And I compose music which is of a modal nature, yes, but I'm not a Greek or a Turkish or an Iranian composer, no, I'm Irish, and I compose music which comes out of the influences which have influenced me during my life. And so I came up with the descriptive title, Contemporary Modal Music, to describe what I do. And I felt that it may be relevant in a broader context, much beyond what someone just like myself does, in that it's something which is contemporary, something which is being done today. It's not modern, it's something which is just being done today. That's the only meaning of contemporary. It is music of a modal nature, so it's not confined to being relevant to one particular nationality or another. It's open to having influences from a variety of different sources. And it also would be something which would be open to people to participate in, regardless of where they may happen to be from. If we look at Western classical music today, there are plenty of composers coming from areas such as Korea or Japan or China or the Far East, which in the past were not involved in that particular type of music, but today are playing a very important role. And so it's a type of music which basically accepts people of various different backgrounds. And I feel that something like that could be of great value in the world of modal music, to have, next to all of the local and individual traditions which we find in each individual place, but to gradually and organically develop a tradition which is rather more open and far less confined to specific borders or specific geographical restrictions. It's also rather interesting that modal music would perhaps be rather more resistant to some of the problems which have plagued Western music in recent, well, for the last century, I would say. Especially in the world of classical music, where we had all sorts of movements of atonality going to quite extreme examples, or free jazz or things like that, where there's a sort of an over-intellectualization of the whole process. And this is something which music which is based on basically a theoretical system is rather more prone to, whereas if you take a music which is based on the element of local idiom, together with the importance of phrasing, by definition there must be a certain agreement between community and artist. The artist cannot really divorce himself from a community, and this is, in my view, something very, very important. And it's something which unfortunately has happened in the Western world, especially in recent decades, is that there's a certain divorce between community and artist, which I feel that the world of modal music will be less susceptible to. But that's just a personal opinion, anyway. So that's what I have to say to you today, and you're now free to ask me any questions or make any points that you wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross.
Christos, you'd perhaps like to moderate this. And so.
Yeah, sure. If somebody has a question, maybe you can step in. Maybe the first one can. Thomas wrote a comment here. Maybe if you want to comment on that, he says Michael Church in his book, The Classic Musics, talk about classical musics as σε εισαγωγικά, rationally systematized can you read it? Can you read this comment?
I don't see it, I'm afraid.
Okay,
No.
it says that Michael Church in his book talks about classical musics as rationally systematized languages that can be taught step by step to someone that wants to learn it, no matter where that person is from, if I remember it right.
Well, I suppose that makes sense, yeah. I really wonder whether rationality is enough, really, to describe it. But also, I would suggest that every music that I've ever encountered, even the most obscure folk traditions, they have a very strong rational component, and they have a language of their own, which they use to describe what's going on. When I came here to Crete in the 1970s, almost nobody here knew how to read or write music. And most of the lyre players didn't even know the names of the notes on their instrument. But they did have a language for describing what they're doing, which was a very, very accurate language, actually. And there was an extremely rational approach to what they were doing as well, together, of course, with another approach, which is extremely important in music. But I don't think I would say that that is an attribute exclusively of what we refer to as Western classical music. We find it in different forms in just about any tradition which I know.
Thomas, a comment on what you wrote also and what Michael Church says, it is a kind of like implicit that whatever is not then rationally systematized, that classical music, that other musics are not rational. It's a kind of, no? We can't hear you.
Which Thomas is it? We have several, actually.
Thomas Carrasco from...
Oh, I can see there on the yes. Yeah.
Now?
Yes.
We can hear you now, yes. Thank you.
Right. Okay. No, it's not about the rationality so much, it's about the systematization of it, like the being books about it, like doing all this. That's what he was saying. He was talking about 15 classical traditions from different parts of the world, in which he included also jazz at this point, talking about it as the African American classical music. So he was kind of developing that subject of the system to teach it.
Yes.
That is, you can afford it as a foreigner also. Or, that's what I understood.
Yes, I see. Yeah. Yeah, I still, writing things in books is an aspect of one particular culture. Other cultures are able to maintain all of that information in their memories without the need of a book, but it's still the same amount of information and the same quality of information. So I think that's a bit of a definition with a rather strong Western bias, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's a difficult thing to define anyway, so I can understand why it's not entirely, so it doesn't fit entirely.
Maybe Jan 8, would you like to?
Yes, please. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the lovely idea. Hello, Mr. Daly. Thank you for the talk. Maybe a follow-up or a quick question. I'm not sure if this is within the scope of today, but if you have any ideas, please let me know. So you were talking about how is it that we can define these traditions, and from what I gathered, you don't really agree with the fact that in the current paradigm we define them with regions. So for example, I'm Lebanese. The music we do, we define it as Oriental because this is what we think of ourselves as relative to the Western, classical. And some other people would say, for example, that okay, we do mid-Oriental or Levantine music. So they will categorize it as that. And of course, they will say Arabic Levantine, because the words and the poetry is very important. Because in our tradition, there is very little instrumental music. So for us, the lyrics are very important. So the question is, if we try to define that music without that element, I think we found ourselves in a very difficult problem to solve, because the elements of the theory are the language, which is Arabic.
Yes.
The modes, which are some of them are Arabic, some of them are Persian, most of it is Ottoman Turkish.
Yes.
And the theory is some of it Ottoman Turkish, some of it parallel to Ottoman but looks like it. So we need to invent a completely new word now to define that tradition, and we need to fix some characters as pillars for that paradigm. And I don't know really whether if we make that choice, whether everybody will agree to it or is somewhat motivated or forced to agree to it, right? It's very loose in that term, in that meaning, and it will create a lot of problems. So the easiest thing is to say, well, it's the music of that region. How would you think about solving that problem? Sorry for taking so long. Thank you.
No problem at all. I completely agree with you. I do not in any way suggest that people should define the music which they already have in any other way than the way they do define it themselves. So yes, the music of your region has the Arabic language. It uses specific modes, some of which derive from Ottoman Turkish, some of which derive from local idioms, some of which even derive from Persian. It is very much the music of the Levant region. I mean, it has that particular sound. You would find similar things in parts of Syria. You would find similar things in Palestine. If we look at your region of the world in the past, it was an ethnic mosaic, basically. There were people of various different communities there. There were Christians, there were Arabs, Muslims, there were Jewish people, there were Druze, and all sorts of other ethnic groups, Armenians as well. However, they all belonged to the local idiom. For example, I can take the example of the city of Istanbul, where there was a huge, it was a city, an Ottoman Turkish city, in which there was a large Greek population. There was also a large Jewish and large Armenian population, and all sorts of other nationalities as well. The music written by each of these different people, regardless of the community that they belonged to, the religious or ethnic community that they belonged to, was all recognizable as the music of that particular area, of that particular city. And if I were to listen to a composition by the Turkish composer Dede Effendi, or the Jewish composer Isak, or the Greek composer Zakaria, these are people from the same time, basically, I would be completely unable to tell which one of them was Greek, which one of them was Turkish, and which one of them was Jewish. It's the music of that particular area. And I would suggest that the same is true of your area as well, that historically the people who inhabited that area, they had the sound of that particular region, and they had the language of that region as well. So, for example, I do have a good friend here in Greece, who is, he's from Syria, but his surname is Yazidjan. He's Armenian, but his language is Arabic, because that's where he grew up, and that's where he was brought up, that's where he was born. So, yes, the language is, of course, an extremely important component. And sometimes in these regions where you would find mixed populations, which was the norm actually in the past, the whole modern concept of the nation state is completely unnatural for that area of the world. It was a construct primarily, I'm afraid, of Western colonial influences. And, you know, the whole idea, we can take the example, for example, of between Greece and Turkey. There was an exchange of populations, as they refer to it. It's actually ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, which took place at the beginning of the 20th century. and ended up putting people in completely unnatural environments. An entire population of something to the order of 250,000 Cretan Muslims were sent to Turkey as Turks, and they didn't speak Turkish. And Christians who spoke only Turkish came to Greece as Greeks. They didn't speak any Greek. And all sorts of examples like that have taken place throughout this entire part of the world over the past basically 2 centuries. And this has produced a somewhat unnatural result. Together with nationalist narratives as well. I mean, for example, here in Greece, the cultural narrative is that everything comes from ancient Greece through Byzantium down to modern Greece. We don't have any influences, not from here, not from there, it's all ours. In Turkey, everything comes from Central Asia, and in the different areas, each one has produced a national narrative which excludes all the others, this is what I find to be unfortunate. Because that is basically untrue. If each of the cultures of this vast area which I described, extending from Northwest Africa right up until Western China, if every region in that whole area has something of great value and beauty, they owe it to the fact that there was a lot of interaction between these different people over not only centuries but millennia. And this is what I find to be a bit of a shame, is that the whole concept of the nation state has basically put an end to that, or almost put an end to it. Fortunately, with contemporary technology, this is beginning to change. And there's a lot more contact developing between these people. But, I can take again the example of Greece and Turkey, which I know very well because I've been living for the last 50 years. Especially, I remember in the 1980s, for example, 1986 specifically, a concert was produced and presented in the city of Athens, which was presenting what was referred to as the music of the Greek composers of Istanbul. This was something which nobody had any idea about whatsoever. Nobody knew anything about it. And what it actually was the people, the composers who belonged to the Greek minority of Istanbul over the centuries. They were just sort of cherry-picked out of the whole body of Ottoman composers and presented as something exclusively Greek, which of course they were not. But it was the first time that people in Greece came into any contact whatsoever with this particular tradition which developed in a city very, very close to themselves, in which there was this multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-denominational element, which was completely natural. Whereas in today's world, it seemed like something from another planet or something, yeah. So this is basically what I'm saying throughout all of this, is that yes, local traditions will always continue and always must continue. They're very, very important to the whole picture. But it's also important to see the collaboration, cooperation, and interaction that can take place between the different cultures and the different regions, even though they may be a very long way apart. So I would certainly not suggest redefining the music of Lebanon. No, absolutely not. No.
If I can comment something, Jan, relating to your question, I guess also a question would be how, for example, if you compose your own music with a group, you or some other people, young or older people in Lebanon, or living somewhere else, but have a main reference to this music, but in their new music they integrate also elements from other musics that are not typical from Lebanon. How would you call it then?
Oh, that's an interesting question actually, because I don't think people have been using any term to denote that. This is just modern pop, right? And it's the same modern pop that you would hear in Greece. It's the same modern pop in Bulgaria. It's the same modern pop in the US. It's the same 4/4 beat. It's the same, 12 scale. And everybody has left the quote unquote traditional modal, except a few groups of selected artists, right? But the mainstream has totally abandoned the classic Ottoman or the classic Levantine Arabic music, whichever what you want to call it. It's not there anymore.
Equally, I would not suggest that we get into a mentality of preserving the past or anything like that, or worshipping the past. No, I consider tradition to be a collective body of knowledge which comes from the past, which is worked with creatively in the present, and which has a proposition for the future. So tradition for me would not be something which is a repetition or copy of the past by any means, no. But I do feel that it's important for each individual tradition to move ahead with a significant percentage of its own material. What I do see happening to a large degree is everything sort of taking a sudden turn in the direction of basically Western pop music, not for artistic reasons, but primarily for reasons of commerciality, which I find that to be rather a shame. Many people tend to see local traditions as being somewhat backward or somewhat outdated or things like that, which again is quite untrue. This is another reason why I chose the term contemporary modal music, because quite often when we refer to traditional music, there's an overemphasis on the past. I mean, I've often heard people, when I used to live in India, people used to say, you know, well, the music of India, it's 6,000 years old. And the implication was that when you listen to somebody like Nikhil Banerjee or Ravi Shankar or someone like that, you're listening to what was played 6,000 years ago, which is completely wrong, of course. What I have noticed is in all of these traditions, let me take the example of North Indian classical music, for example. The amount of progress and the enormous leaps which have taken place during the last 60 or 70 years is quite astounding, and perhaps I can't think of any other tradition which has covered so much ground in such a short space of time. I can also say the same thing about other traditions as well, that there's been a lot of development, a lot of creative work in the present day, which tends to be ignored because everybody's concentrating so heavily on the legacy of the past, which is connected to the ethnic narrative. And that's another reason why the ethnic narrative is a bit problematic as well.
Giuliano, you've raised your hand? Or you were...
Yes. Hi everyone. Hi Ross.
Also Evan, I think, also afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I'm going to change a bit the subject, but of course, if you want to go
yes,
back,
of course, yeah.
we're free. No, I was curious because you mentioned, Ross, these two pillars of, you know, the construction of this Eastern modal music, the phrases and the idiom, the local idioms. And I was curious how do you define phrase? What is a phrase? What constitutes a phrase? Maybe, I don't know, or if you can talk a bit about that.
Good question. Well, let me think how to put this. You know, if we take, there are theory books of the various modal traditions. Let's take a Turkish one. And you'll see a makam described as we have this tetrachord here, and above that we have a pentachord going up there, we have the octave scale, we have an extension above and an extension below. And then they say, well, then you have a dominant note, and then you have this note where you can make stops, and this note where you can make secondary stops. Okay. If you take that information and say, okay, I'm now going to play music with that information in mind, what you will see is that nothing comes out. This information does not translate into music. So what you end up with is a musical phrase, and this is something agreed on by a community, and this is why I mentioned the community agreement in the final stage of what I said, is that there is a communal aesthetic which basically defines that. So there is a particular type of melodic aesthetic which you find in each environment. Let's take the example of the city of Istanbul, for example. Yes, there is a local musical idiom which has a certain melodic type which is used there, and which the people will actually recognize as being something which is ours. this connection for me is very important, that you're able to produce a piece of music which somebody else who is connected to you personally can actually feel, oh, this is something I recognize, this is something which I know, this is something which I feel to be mine also. So this is the connection which I find to be important. So a phrase is a unit of melodic material, which you might say, which conforms to an agreement of a community. That which is considered to be a phrase in, shall we say, the north of England, may be very, very different from that which is considered to be a phrase in the south of India. They may not recognize the one, the phrase of the other, or they may, we never know. But what is important is that it is somehow recognizable within a community. That's what I personally would find to be important. And especially within the world of maqam, for example, we do have certain maqams which have quite large areas where they work, that they move in a quite large range. But we have other maqams, however, which quite literally are perhaps just one little phrase. Well, we can take the example of there's a rather obscure maqam known as Nishabur, which starts on the second degree of Buserik. And it really is a very, very small little entity of 3 or 4 at the most notes in a specific configuration. That's all it really is. And there's not much else you can do with it. It's just that one little phrase. In Persian music, they tend to see this in a different light. They have a small number of maqams, which are large melodic entities, and they have a great number of what they call gusheha, which literally means corners in the Persian language. And these are little melodic components, which are phrases. They're quite flexible and they're quite elastic. You can stretch them this way or that way, and they're still recognizable. And they're usable in specific contexts within the trajectory of the dastgah, which is the main maqam. I find their analysis to be particularly relevant, actually. Sometimes the Turkish and Arabic narrative, which tends, especially in recent decades, to see everything within the context of tetrachords, pentachords, and octave scales, I find that to be a little bit deceptive sometimes. If you look at a Persian theory book, an Iranian theory book, you'll find that they're very, very little concerned with scales, much, much more concerned with specific phrase material, which they actually learn by rote. But which is also flexible. They can also improvise with it, and they can also develop it and extend it.
Great, thank you very
Evan,
much.
I think you want to ask something, yeah?
Ross, it's great to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
I've always been curious. I love the even in the etymology of tradition, we acknowledge that there's a conversation happening, and it's not just happening between contemporary communities, but it's happening with the history of that music as well. So it is to the past. But in this idea of a communal aesthetic, there's one part that I'm how does one straddle that line of searching for a communal aesthetic that's anchored? Let's just maybe agree that it's anchored, or that these traditions are anchored in sort of style-specific vocabularies or languages, and there's a sense that one needs to be responsible to that vocabulary, to actually put it on the table as something in which the community can decide. Not for a particular narrative and not for the sake of, say, something vague like authenticity, but more just for an aesthetic value judgment about the quality of the work or the composition or the performer or the where is that line get
Where
drawn?
is the line? Exactly.
Being responsible to the vocabulary, or deciding to move it into another realm where is that the community can agree that we got something new here with these new shared elements.
Well, There's always a pushing of the boundaries. I mean, you have the established forms and the established material, which everybody knows, and they all feel happy with it. Usually, however, you will find that if somebody is creating music, very much playing it safe all the way, people will find that to be boring because it's something which has already happened. Whereas if you see somebody who's trying something new, making an effort to explore new ground, new areas and things, depending on what balance he can actually strike, it will either be accepted or perhaps rejected. Or it may be accepted at a later date, you never know. But I think this has been going on in just about every musical tradition, including Western classical music, of course, where something like Tchaikovsky's violin concerto was referred to as sort of catcalls in an alley at the time when it was written, and much later it was of course revered. So there is always this element of pushing the boundaries and how far can you go before it becomes rejected, or within a time frame as well. Concerning the aspect of community with what we refer to as traditional music, I'm not quite sure of the etymology of tradition in English, but the word we use in Greek is paradosi, which literally means to give something down the line. So the emphasis on tradition in Greek is actually on the giving, not so much of the holding back. So you're giving something, and once you've given it, it's no longer yours. It belongs to the next one. So properly speaking, that's what should be happening. We have another word which is parakratisi, which means holding it back, and this is what we use for the tax office. But yeah, and I also use another example sometimes to help people understand this a little bit better. I have many students who, they're maybe learning an instrument which is from a part of the world that they themselves are not from. And they want to know, how am I doing? Do I fit into the, am I a good example? Let's say I have a student who's learning Turkish saz. And the student wants to know, how am I doing? Am I doing okay? What I would say to them is, well, go somewhere in Turkey, to any Turkish city, and go and find the musician's cafe. It exists in every city. You'll find it in every city. And go there and say, here I am, I play saz. And they'll say to you, okay, play something for us. And you play something. If you're good, they'll say, oh, bravo, very good, well done, yeah. If you're not particularly good, they'll say, not so good, you need work. You should be happy with that, because that means that you're within the subject, you're just not very good yet. But if they sort of look at you like this, that means you are from another planet, we don't know what you're doing, and it's completely unrecognizable to us. And this is strangely accurate, actually, because the people within the community of where that particular sound, that instrument, and that music comes from, the people themselves, they do know it. They may not be educated musicologists or things like that, no, of course not. But the sound, when they hear something which is good within that particular framework, they know it. I actually witnessed that in reality once. I went to Turkey we have a very good saz player here in Greece called Periklis Papapetropoulos. And of course the saz is not played in Turkey, not played in Greece. It's a Turkish instrument. But Periklis has studied it very extensively. He's a very, very good saz player, and he knows the whole Turkish repertoire and everything. He's very, very good. And we went to the city of Bursa in Turkey, and the person who had organized the concert for us took us to the cafe of the musicians. And he presented our friend Periklis and said, here he is, he plays saz. And the people in the cafe said, let's play something for us. And Periklis, because he does actually play very well, he started playing. And within 10 minutes, there were 200 people in the cafe. So this is an indication that, you see, the people, they know what they're listening to. If it's something which is really good, they will go. And they will all say, yes, this is something which we know. However, as I said initially, there is the other aspect, which is that the musician himself is always pushing the boundaries, and you have to sort of see how far you can go. It's a sort of a game, seeing how far you can go before you lose everybody, or how far you can go and take people with you and broaden the scope. It's a very delicate issue. Yeah.
I think Anna had a question, and then Fadil.
Anna, yes, of course. Yeah.
Good evening again. Thank you very much for the beautiful discussion. I would like to ask a question about education.
Yes.
Since you mentioned that it would be so nice that people from other countries and other traditions that don't have much in common with Makam get interested and want to devote years of their life and study this with respect and dedication. So when do you think, what could be the most effective educational models for that? Because it's about many people, let's say, that can be involved in this process.
Well, yes, everything which we want to do involves what we refer to as a study period, where we would study something. I would imagine that if you've taken an interest, or if anybody were to take an interest in modal music, they would probably be attracted, initially at least, to one particular culture, perhaps, or one or two, maybe, I don't know. What is necessary, in my view, is that a person studies at least one of these traditions in considerable depth, that you go into it and you study it going to quite a deep level. I've often described my own, one of my own apprenticeships, which was with the lyra player Kostas Mundakis here on Crete, who he gave me the task, basically, for a period of about 4 or 5 years of copying every little detail of what he played, and he would give me little bits of knowledge every once in a while, and I'd have to copy it exactly. And I had to do this for about 4, almost 5 years. And so when I got to the stage where I was able to do that reasonably well, he then said, okay, now stop doing that, we have to start looking for your music, which I found to be very, very important, because yes, you go through that stage, that initial stage where you absorb the material, what I referred to previously is the traditional material, that which is coming from the past, the collective knowledge of the past. And this whole process of imitation was the way he had to give me what he had. And so this was an important stage. But beyond that, I have to then find a way to find my sound. And that, however, would not be the same as his sound, because we're different people. So I would have to allow every other influence in every other aspect of my life to come into that as well. Otherwise, it would be false. So this is a very important stage as well. How a person does that, and this is actually the very interesting contribution which people from outside of the very specific traditions which we're speaking about can actually make an interesting contribution, because they're going to allow aspects of themselves to come into the picture which would perhaps not be relevant to somebody who is native to one particular region or another. So I would find that to be of particular importance.
Fadil?
Just this Thanks, Master, for this great talk, and thank you for making this opportunity for all the coming forward talks. Actually, this is a great thing to have. Just a few comments and a question, Master, about the definition. Actually, when we talk about the great European music, they call it great European music because there is a problem in the definition. Because it includes the classical, we start from the medieval and go right away to the 20th century classifications. So there is a problem in the definition, actually. Sometimes we call it great European music. Sometimes we call it classical with the capital C to distinguish that from the small classical years or decades. But talking about phrases that travel, which is a very interesting thing that I heard you saying. Phrases travel. We have seen such music that I just mentioned now travel to Japan, to China, to everywhere. And it becomes another kind of music that's somewhere else in a different geography and among different ethnicities and conditions and even time frames. The thing is, two things here. Can this modal music travel? I think it does, and we have seen Labyrinth doing it actually for decades, and it is spreading beyond the physical community to everywhere in the world, as well as what we see, like compositions, this kind of culture that's happening every now and then, but you tell me, I mean, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think every music can travel to the degree that it can be accepted in new locations. One example I could think of is I myself studied North Indian music in the early and mid 1970s, and at that time there were people from the Western world who were studying that music. Some were doing pretty well. One of my own teachers was actually Scottish, and in London, and they were doing quite well. But of course, they were never really accepted by the Indian music community. They were always thought to be okay. Well, it's very nice that they're doing this and they're taking the trouble to learn our music, but no, we do not accept them as being equal. And okay, decades have passed. And today, things are quite different. Today, which is more than 50 years down the line, there are a number of Western exponents of North Indian classical music who are extremely good and who are quite the equal, if not the better, of several Indians. And they're actually being accepted. So once they are accepted, these are not people who are just copying something which they found. They're also working as creative artists. So new elements which they're bringing in to this tradition are going to be accepted if they're actually accepted as musicians in their own right. So this is one way in which that does actually happen. I can think of other examples as well, where musicians from one community have come to another and have become accepted gradually. There's also, if you look at the history of Afghan music of the 19th century, I believe it was the ruler Amanullah Shah who brought a whole troupe of musicians from North India to the Khyrabat region of Kabul and settled them there. And they became the teachers of the Afghan musicians. And so there's a sort of a grafting of North Indian music onto that of Afghanistan in the late 19th century, which continues to this day, actually. To the degree that something becomes accepted in its new region and becomes not only accepted but actually digested so that they're starting to work with it in a creative manner, I think that is a clear indication of its ability to travel. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you very much. Actually, Kantamir is a good example where
Kantamir is an excellent example.
From those days we have seen Ajamler, Indian pieces, whatever, and it continues in similar collections later on.
Yes, Kantamir himself, who was from Moldavia, he wasn't even from Turkey, and he did a collection in which, as you mentioned, there are pieces, Ajamler, which means pieces which were brought to the Ottoman court by Persian musicians, by Indian musicians, by all sorts of different people, and it was all sort of a melting pot in a way. Yeah.
Thank you, Fadil. Someone else would like to comment or ask something? Maybe I can ask a question or comment something. Ross, when you were talking about, the over-intellectualization of music,
Yes.
and you brought examples of free jazz and atonality. I was wondering if these genres of music are not, apart from these characteristics that they may have, are not the expression again of another community that maybe has this kind of ideas, or even many times these music are connected also with the philosophical, like, let's say, views of the world, etc. So I was wondering to what degree the connection with the community, but also the type of community is interesting when we're talking about contemporary creation music, because I guess when you talk about technology, when you say that the existence of technology makes possible the creation of new musics, of course we're talking about the recording of music and having, so you can listen to music that's created in India, while some 100 years ago you should go there, 150 years. But I guess also we're talking about the technology more in general, the fact that you can actually be a resident of the world in, we can be traveling, and our music making and our community is not defined by the limits of geography, no? So I guess different types of music will emerge to the degree that different types of communities, international or will be created as they are. I think since the 50s, 60s, we have these types of communities that are connected not by space, but by ideas or interests, or sometimes maybe religion. So I was wondering what are your ideas on that?
Well, of course, technology is going to play a very big role in the way communities develop in the future as well, because exactly as you suggest, communities are not going to be defined geographically anymore. Even today, they're no longer defined entirely as geographical entities. So communities will develop around ideas, around aesthetics, around all sorts of things. Some quite positive, some maybe quite negative, actually. But that's what will happen. That will also affect music. So music will, in many ways, become much less regional. That's already happened. I mean, that's happened many decades ago, actually, with basically Western pop music taking over the whole world, really, which is what has happened. Personally, I don't find that to be a very positive development, and I find it very, very important that people are able to listen to a music created by somebody who resembles them, somebody who's like them, which they can identify with on a much deeper level. I mean, I remember several years ago, during one concert of, I think it was Lady Gaga, she went on stage dressed in meat as a sort of a gimmick, I suppose, really. And within the whole pop world, it became necessary to become more and more and more and more extreme, going to more and more extremes. And suddenly there's a major disconnect between the person who's listening to this music and the person who's producing it. The one is like something from another planet, and the person who's receiving this particular product is just an ordinary person. I, as an ordinary person, I'm much, much happier listening to music which comes from another ordinary person like myself. I find it rather uncomfortable to be listening to the music of somebody who is so far removed from me as to be like from another planet almost. Yeah. And I think many people perhaps feel that way. I don't suggest that everyone does, but I think many people, they're able to connect with something which is produced by somebody who is not very different from themselves. So in that particular context, I think that the majority of communities are always going to be created by people who are looking for something which is familiar to them. Well, we'll see anyway.
But at the same time, you talked about the need also for surprise, not for something new.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, I saw recently a part of an interview of Babis Papadopoulos, which is one of the main musicians from Tripes, which is like one of the, maybe the most important like rock group, or don't know exactly how you call that, in the 80s maybe. Yeah, I'm not a specialist. Anyway, and he was saying that, you know, like reflecting on what they were doing, he was saying that, you know, we were looking for something new, and the music that came, the rock music, sounded like something new. And of course, we were not very conscious back then that it was supported by, by a system or by a more, let's say, colonialist, it was not only music, of course, no? It was a lot of money and a media, let's say, enterprise. But I'm wondering, I don't know, also for me, for example, when I started to play the ney, also it was something, because it was something very different from what I knew. I studied classical music, like Baroque music, and what intrigued me was that it was completely different from what I knew, or Indian music, that it was, again, completely different from whatever I knew. So I was wondering, also, again, the limits, no, of something that is you feel comfortable with, but at the same time that challenges what you're doing. And inside this, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. The music which I play also, when I started in this direction, it was very unfamiliar to me, and I think it is to any of us. But you go through a process of familiarizing it. And you actually, you study it, you absorb it, and you digest it. The interesting thing is, because of Labyrinth we have, as I've said, approximately 80% of our students are studying an instrument or a music which is from somewhere that they are not from. So I quite often get this question asked of me, which is, well, is it really possible for somebody from Belgium to learn to play the Turkish saz, or somebody from Norway to learn to play the Cretan lira? And the answer to that question is yes, of course it's possible. It's possible. You go and you immerse yourself in that particular tradition for a period of between 5 and 10 years, I would say, depending on the degree of difficulty of the tradition in question. And you can master that tradition to the same degree that somebody from there can. But the difference is that you can't stay there, because when you get to the point where you have absorbed it, much like what I did with my teacher, who made me copy him for 5 years, and then you are told, okay, now you have to find your sound, you have to be yourself. That's when something else comes into play, everything else which is in your life, which is not within the life of the person who's from there. So that's where interesting things start to happen, and you start to find new things, and you start to find new connections, which perhaps you wouldn't have seen before, or perhaps nobody would have seen before. So there's always this dialogue between the familiar and the unfamiliar. And we're always trying to find how far we can go with the unfamiliar before it becomes unrecognizable. And that's when things start to move into rather dangerous areas. But yeah, that's an important part of any creative process, in my view, is pushing the boundaries of the unfamiliar before you get into the unrecognizable.
Mm. Yeah, nicely put. Andrea?
Hi. So I have a question. It might be kind of basic, but there's a phenomenon that's been going on, at least in the United States, for, I don't know, at least 40 years, where people who discover a traditional, let's say a traditional music of another country, let's say Turkish music or Greek music or Arabic music, and they fall in love with it and then become kind of the arbiters of what should be preserved and what shouldn't be preserved and what is authentic. I'm not an ethnomusicologist. What should be preserved, this idea of authenticity, and oh, it's so tragic that people in Turkish villages are, you know, listening to whomever, Lady Gaga, and using electric instruments. Oh, it should be like this. And we, you know, the non-Turkish or non-Greek people or non-Egyptian people, we're preserving it the correct way. That's something that's, I don't know if it goes on in Europe, but it's definitely a thing in the United States. And I'd really like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, America does have a long history of Puritanism, so I suppose it fits into the example. No, but to be on a more serious note, yeah, it's a bit dangerous actually to start being judgmental to that degree. I mean, a lot of what I hear being done here on Crete, where I live, you know, and I love Cretan music, I've studied it for 50 years. A lot of what I hear being done today, I don't particularly like. I'm much happier listening to Kostas Mundakis, Athanasios Kordalos, people like that, you know, who I love their music. But I would never say that you shouldn't be doing this, you know, to somebody younger who's doing something which is more influenced by pop or something. I will say that I don't particularly like it, if I don't like it. I feel that's being honest. And if somebody asks me, what do you find to be, well, what do you prefer, I'll show them what I do prefer to that. And if they agree with me, okay. If they don't, okay. It's their world as well, it's not just mine. So I think that there is a case for expressing your opinion, but not necessarily enforcing your judgment or trying to sort of be didactic about it, you know, sort of that. I know these particular traditional music circles where they become very dogmatic and things like that, and I don't agree with it. No.
Thank you, Andrea. But I guess also somebody else would like maybe to, yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Hey there. By the way, sorry about the being late. I just realized that you guys are like 1 hour behind me here.
Time difference. Yeah.
I looked before. What is CET, Central European Time? And for some reason, I thought it was 3 hours behind. But no, I'm coming in and I'm like, why is everyone asking him questions? Oh, anyway, sorry about that. I missed some good points, apparently. But at any rate, I wanted to just chime in on what Andrea was contributing to, and I wanted to add another layer to it, if I can, which is that what about the indigenous masters of whatever tradition being arbiters of their own tradition and weeding out, selecting their own cultural identity? Is that always fair? We can go beyond that to that level too. We can say, like, for instance, in Turkish music, what people think of Turkish music is really like Turkish classical music is basically like mostly 19th and 20th century music for the most part. And even like people that are classically trained, you know, like ask them for repertoire. Most of the repertoire they know is like stuck in the 19th and 20th century.
Yes.
And so it's kind of interesting selection that people do themselves, and then we can question that maybe even.
Well, in the case of the example you mentioned of Turkish music, and the fact that much of what we hear today, if not most of it, is actually 19th and 20th century. There is one rather good reason for that, which is that is the part of that particular tradition which is directly accessible to us. There is a living connection to it. Well, you know, some of the ney masters of today, they can trace their lineage back to the mid-19th century. Also, the fact that we don't really know what the Ottoman Turkish music was prior to the mid-19th century. A lot of it is conjecture, actually. And there are people today working on that. I mean, someone like Fikret Karakaya, for example, with his Besmara orchestra, is working on the very, very old stuff. And there are other people who specialize in that repertoire as well. But mostly that which has come down as a living tradition to the modern day is from the mid-19th century onwards. And it sort of conforms to a rather more contemporary aesthetic. It's also the music, it's the time frame in which what we know as the meyhane, which was the rather more secular environment of the music, appeared, where music was entertainment, basically. Because the music of the Ottoman palace basically died out quite a while before the end of the Ottoman Empire anyway. I mean, the final sultans paid no attention to it whatsoever. And then, of course, there's the music of the religious environment. That's remained, well, not really static, no, that's also changed, but it's rather more conservative, and it's something which is relevant to a specific sect of society. And that music was actually even almost forbidden at one time during the 20th century after the reforms of the Turkish Republic. So basically that which came down to the modern day was the music of the entertainment world of the early 20th century, maybe a bit of the late 19th as well. And even the instruments which would have been used prior to 1850 were radically different from those which are used today. There was no kanun, there was no oud, there was no lira. All of these instruments didn't exist. There was the cheng, the sharud, the rebab, all these other instruments which we don't even know how they played them. So that's also a bit of a barrier as well. And much of what we have in the contemporary Ottoman repertoire was written down in its contemporary Western notation form by someone like Rauf Yekta, using as a source a person called Zekaydede, who was a very important source for him. So that's sort of what's come down as a living tradition in a way. Everything else, okay, we're not entirely sure about it, how much it actually does come from that very distant time or not. When there are compositions attributed to Al-Farabi from the 9th century, which we know full well are not his compositions.
On the other hand, you do have the Al-Ufki, Mejmua, and you have Kantemir's work, as you mentioned. So that does contribute something to our knowledge of at least the 17th century.
Oh, it does, yes. But that material is just being worked on very recently. I mean, up until just 2 or 3 decades ago, of the whole Kantemir collection, we had very little. It's largely due to the efforts of Owen Wright that a lot of it has come to our attention. The works actually played of Kantemir up until, should we say, the 1980s. Very, very few, not very many works were played. People didn't really tend to pay attention. They didn't really feel that that was accessible in any way. It's only fairly recently that that's happened.
By the way,
the sort of what's developed in Turkey actually is is like what we have in the Western world. We have an early music area, and this is actually happening also in the Turkish music as well. An early music department is happening, with all the same problems and difficulties which early music has in the Western world.
I was just going to say that one of the next talks of Panos Poulos will be on this subject.
Yes.
Specifically, so if people are interested in that.
Yes, Panos has worked on that a lot. Yeah, he knows it very well.
Somebody else? Thank you, Peter.
Thanks. Yeah. Comment.
Can I make a question?
Yeah, Apostolis, yes.
If we let's make an hypothesis that we gather the best teachers.
Sorry.
You as well, dear Ross, and because you have gave us a lot all these years, and we're very thankful for this. And if we make an hypothesis and we gather the best teachers, and we try to make something like the jazz musicians have done. You said about the scales and to take the Ionian, the Dorian, and if we take this, our scales, our modes and our tetrachords and pentachords and the dominants and the phrases, and maybe the phrases of each tradition, can we make a new system about to give to the students, or this is impossible?
Well, let me put it this way. Each of the systems which we have thus far, either the Turkish Makam system, the Arabic Makam system, the Iranian Dastgah, or the Byzantine Ichos, each of these systems is basically looking at the same material just from a different perspective. And of course with a different local idiom as well, different local pronunciation you might call it. What I do find interesting is seeing the common ground between them. But what one does have to be careful about is the following. I know many students who, here in Greece for example, they study Makam, but they try and study Byzantine Ichos at the same time and always draw parallels between the two. And what happens is that they get horribly confused because there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some rather significant differences because they are seeing basically the same material but from different perspectives. What I do consider to be important is that, let's say you study the one tradition, you study Ottoman Makam, for example, and then you go and you study the Persian Radif. But you complete a full cycle of study on the one, then go and complete a full cycle on the other, then go and study Byzantine Ichos, for example. Well, once you've studied each one of these things in its own right, you then see all of the connections quite naturally, and they make perfect sense. But if you try and combine them together and always draw comparisons from the very beginning of your studies, you'll get horribly confused. So that's why I would advocate for that specifically, is that study the one tradition, study the other and the other, as many as you can, that's great. But study each one in its own right and on its own terms. And once you've acquired a certain mastery of 2 or 3 of them, you then see the connections very easily and they make perfect sense and they're not confusing. It would of course be very interesting if a group of people were to get together, representatives of each of the traditions, and to try and create what you might call a theoretical framework which would be relevant to this particular type of music specifically. One of the big problems with all the theory books that I find in Arabic, Turkish and Persian music, they're all copying Western theory books. And as a result, they're very confusing. And in many cases, wildly inaccurate. And because they're trying to keep everything in line with a Western theory book or something like that. And I've often noticed that I would sit with some master musician from one of these areas, and they would describe the theory which is in the books, and then they would pick up the instrument and do something totally different. And that always was a bit of a problem until I figured out that no, what is in the books actually is not a reflection of what they're doing. And so it becomes important. I think there is a need, and I think many people perceive that need. I've noticed that in Turkey especially. There is a need for a revision of the theory of Turkish music. And I would suggest the same is true for Arabic music as well, and also Iranian music. That there's a need for a revision of the theory and to update it, to upgrade it somewhat, so that it comes into alignment with the practice itself.
I'm asking this question mostly if there is a way to produce for the new musicians, for the young people that are learning this music, if there is a way to produce quality music, Modal.
Yes.
Let's say your definition, I think, is very, very good. Contemporary Modal music.
Uh-huh.
And if all these young students come and ask the teachers,
Uh-huh.
all right, I want to become a good musician in 5 years, 20 years, but I want to compose with a Modal way.
Yes.
How can I do it?
Well, I think it's very important to study the source material. For example, let's say you've taken one particular tradition. To play a lot of the repertoire of that particular tradition, because it's from the repertoire that you will learn all of the phrase material and all of that whole body of knowledge. So once you've done that, you've actually absorbed, and then you gradually digest all of that material, so then you can start to use it in a creative manner. One thing which of course does work to the disadvantage of this particular type of music is that it takes a long time to learn. There is no fast track. It's for people who enjoy the long journey, and it's for people who enjoy the process as much as the result. You know, in today's contemporary pop music culture, you know, if you're a pop musician, your career is over when you're 25. In our particular type of music, there is no such thing as a master under the age of 40. It just doesn't happen. It takes that long to absorb and digest all of this material. And if you're happy with that, okay. If you're not, become a pop musician. But you better hurry, because time runs out very quickly for them. But yeah, so it is something which, I mean, for example, in recent years, I've written a lot of pieces in the semai form, which you find in Turkish and Arabic music. I studied that form for 20 years before I wrote my first one. And it really did take that long to absorb all of that. Maybe I was a bit slow, I don't know, but anyway. But it does take that long to really absorb all of that stuff and to be able to really work with it creatively. And well, it requires patience, and it requires actually enjoying that process. Because if you don't enjoy it, you know, it's better to leave it alone. But yeah, if you happen to enjoy that long process of gradually absorbing this material and digesting it and getting closer to it, closer, until eventually one day it all makes sense and it starts to fall into place. Yes, it takes time, and it's a matter of absorbing and digesting a massive amount of material, source material, which you then have to find a way to use creatively, not just to copy. Sorry.
can a young student, so sorry for taking so long, so can a young student say, okay, I will take the modes, and I will take from jazz the harmony, and I will make something new?
You can do that if you wish, yes, yeah.
But still the result is, it is not going to be from the local communities accepted, for sure.
Well, quite possibly not, but what matters is that the person who creates that particular type of music is able to actually enjoy it and actually to feel connected with it. And if that person feels connected with it, and this is an authentic expression of myself. By the way, the term authentic, just because somebody else mentioned it previously, you can only be authentic to yourself. It doesn't make sense. I cannot be authentic to your grandfather, for example. You can only be authentic to yourself, and you can be an authentic representation of who and what you are. And yourself is the sum total of the things that you love in this life. So if you happen to love this particular type of music, you can be authentic to that type of music because you love it, not because you're copying somebody else. Sorry. So basically, you create a type of music which you yourself, you love it so much that you cannot not do it. And if you do that, I feel pretty certain that you will find other people who will appreciate it. And it doesn't matter what anybody calls it, or if somebody else doesn't like it. It's what it is, and it's yours, and it's valid. What I mentioned, the whole concept of contemporary modal music, giving a definition to a particular category of music, which not only myself, but a number of other people that I know are also engaged in working in that particular field, and they happen to find it exciting and interesting, and they love it. So that's why we do it, for no other reason. Not trying to make a point or to prove a point or anything like that, no. Just because it's something which we love doing.
Thank you, Apostolis. Stella?
Okay, thank you. So I hope my question does not diverge too much from the scope of your talk, Ross. So whether urban or rural, this traditional educational setting of having a disciple sitting together with a teacher in a face-to-face context has been an extremely important part of the absorption of both phrasing and idiom, I guess.
Yes.
And even if we still consider this to be a very relevant and important process, and I guess this is what Labyrinth has been supporting over the years, teleconferencing for teaching music has been becoming an important part of the educational process for many in the last years. So I would like your take on how you think this may be affecting the absorption of phrasing and idiom in the long run, if at all.
Well, either in a teleconference or in a face-to-face meeting, you have an exchange of very specific material between two people. In the case of the teleconferencing, there is a limit, at least as far as technology is in the present day. Whereas the face-to-face meeting, there is a lot more that takes place on a level which we perhaps don't even perceive consciously. But a lot more goes between two people in a face-to-face meeting than can actually go in a teleconference. The information which you wish to pass, the one to the other, is, I suppose, identical, and it depends on what that person wishes to give to the other. I don't think that the medium necessarily affects the content all that much. Just that the medium, in the one case, a lot transpires between two people, which in a live setting, which perhaps it's not quite the same in a conference setting. There's a bit of a barrier there in a way. But I think the material, the basic material is identical. Yeah. If I'm showing somebody something which is played in a specific village on Crete to somebody who is in London through a teleconference, the material I'm giving him is the same as if he were in the room with me today, but just the experience is different.
Thank you, Stella. So, Siros, you have a crazy camera there.
Hello.
Wow. Hello.
The camera follows us. I would like to ask if you consider that there is a considerable production. I do not like the word production, but creation of contemporary modal music, because the title of our discussion today is contemporary modal music. We as students, we keep studying tradition. Do you consider that there is an interesting creation of contemporary modal music in the Eastern Mediterranean, apart few exceptions? Okay, it's you, but do you consider that there is a creation of contemporary modal music nowadays?
Well, I do know a number of composers who are working in that direction, and some of them are extremely good, actually, and particularly interesting. And there's an ever-increasing number of them. Many of them I discover day by day, and I didn't know them previously. Just as a matter of information, at the Musical Workshop Labyrinth here on Crete, the program of seminars for this coming summer will be focusing very, very heavily on that particular subject. I'll be inviting different composers of this particular type of music to come and teach their repertoire and their approach to composition. So, apart from the fact that I do actually see a growing interest in this particular type of music, I'm also doing the best I can to help cultivate an interest in this particular type of music through the medium of the Musical Workshop Labyrinth, which we'll be focusing on that subject in a fairly large way this coming summer. So yes, I do feel that there's a growing interest in this particular type of music, and a growing body of work also, which is gradually appearing.
So we need to know more. We would like to know more about, because as I said before, we as students, we are studying traditional masters, let's say.
Where are you studying?
Okay. Excuse me?
Where are you studying?
Here with Dimitris and Apostolis and
in Syros,
Maria,
yeah?
in Syros, yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Studying the older traditional material, I would certainly never disagree with that. You're going to get some valuable source material from there. But if you're interested in learning some compositions of contemporary composers, I'd be happy to provide you with some examples, if you like. Send me a message on Facebook or something, or to the email of Labyrinth, and I'll be happy to send you some examples.
Okay, thank you. And also I would like to say that BRIAM is the acronym for this project. Yes. I had the idea that that stands for Cultural Bridges Across the Mediterranean. So it's BRIAM.
Oh, okay.
Shared across the Mediterranean as a food also.
Well, that's a food I'm particularly partial to, so yeah, it's very nice.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Would anybody like to make another question or comment something? sorry, I was reading Asimina's. I think Asimina Katerina is talking about maybe the concert in Crete right now with Yoros Manolakis, maybe. Not sure.
Yes, there is a concert.
There's a concert there, yeah.
Yes, starting in 40 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if there are no more questions, Apostoli, you want to say something?
Somebody is asking these references to have for everybody. So please, Ross, I don't know, these references that you said about the contemporary composers. Yes. Everybody wants to know to know them. So
okay,
we can put them on the. So we have a site, Estudiantina Cyclades. So
which site?
We're going to make a site, a new site, with the recordings of this seminar and all the seminars, the virtual. Okay. So maybe we're gonna put the reference under this.
Okay, of course, yes, yeah. Yes, send me your email and then I can send you whatever material you'd like. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, some of the ideas that we've talked various times with Ross is to make like an archive also with a list of contemporary compositions from different composers. Yes. In relation with this music. And I mean, also related with what we were saying before, we were talking about the tradition of the classical repertoire that it makes sense, of course, to study and know and listen to. And then sometimes we're going to the other extreme, like pop music, or like let's say the examples that are not maybe so interesting, but they are very present, no? But I think in the whole continuum in between, there are so many other things that can happen, so diverse, and that really I think as well as societies we should be investing more time and means and money towards this end. And I think this is part of what Labyrinth is as a community tries to do, to study the old stuff, but also the new, and without it being, contradicting. You can study the classical styles or the folk traditions, or name it however you want, but also be creative and do, new music, not to call it your own. Yeah.
Oh, it's very important, yes. Yeah.
So, thank you so much, Ross.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And see you next month. The next talk is with Socrates Sinopoulos on the 5th of May, again, Monday, at the same time. It will be great to see you again.